So welcome back, everyone, or a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us just now. You've reached the Econpool Europe Annual Conference 2020, a digital format due to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. And following on from what we heard earlier from the EU Commissioner Johannes Hahn and also Econpool President Clemens Fuchs, we now want to explore the topic of balancing new challenges, sustainable and inclusive growth in Europe with 4 leading economists and finance experts. We have here with us Ivan Faiella. He's senior economist at the Bank of Italy. He is a member of the Italian Observatory on Energy Poverty, of the G20 Energy Sustainability Working Group, of the Network for Greening the Financial System, and to the Committee for the Estimation of Natural Capital. So I'm sure we can look forward to a huge chunk of contribution when it comes to the EU Green Deal and where all the Recovery and Resilience Fund money should go to in order to keep the EU's goal of being decarbonized by 2050 in order to actually make that possible. So Ivan Faiella, welcome.
Good morning, everybody.
Also, we welcome Dr. Jörg Kukies. He is State Secretary for Financial Market Policy and European Policy at the German Federal Ministry of Finance. He previously spent 14 years with Goldman Sachs International, so he really knows about money, beginning as an associate in the product development team in London before becoming head of equities division for Germany and Austria. And obviously, we look very much forward to your contribution also in how Germany is tackling this current pandemic with huge aid packages, but also how all this, hopefully the planning beyond the pandemic. I know that there are certain challenges that you will mention that Germany has to tackle and hopefully in a coordinated effort with Europe. So a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Then we say hello to, and this is now a challenge, but a challenge that I will accept. We say hello to Piroska Mohacsi. She is interim director of LSE's Institute of Global Affairs. Therefore, she is responsible for various global policy initiatives on financial resilience, innovation, digital currencies, growth and innovation. Previously, she was a policy director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, overseeing strategic directions and policy initiatives in emerging Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. So there, first of all, it's good to have you with us. And obviously, we sort of, not necessarily the outside perspective, you know, but it always, when you look at challenges, it's always good to be able to take a step back and see the big picture. And I'm sure you'll be able to contribute to that for us. And last but not least, and I'm very happy to see her now. She's online now. We welcome to the panel Agnès Bénassy-Quéré. She's chief economist of the French Treasury and member of the Bruegel board. Madame Bénassy-Quéré's research interests include, amongst others, the European integration, and she worked for the Ministry of the Economy and Finance before moving to academic positions. So, bienvenue. We're very happy that you made it now, because originally I wanted to start with you, and now I can, which is good. I can stick to my plans. Now, before we talk about the solutions to the challenges, first of all, we have to define those challenges from our various perspectives. So what are these new challenges that we're talking about, and what impact do they have on European sustainable and inclusive growth? And I would like to start with you, Madame Bénassy-Quéré, because we know that France, we heard it earlier, has been very hard hit by the pandemic. Economic activity fell very sharply. The National Statistics Office, INSEE, expects the economy to shrink by 9 to 10% this year. Do you actually have time now to think about sustainable and inclusive growth? Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I am so happy to be with you. Sorry for being a bit late. I had a different address actually for the meeting. So may I share my screen? Is it possible? No, it's not.
that we also we've advised to use, if possible, no slides, because it's very difficult to do that on that small screen.
Okay, so the question you were asking to me is whether I have time to think about more long-term perspectives, and the answer is yes, definitely, and I will explain why. I think that it's quite useful to come back to this crisis and to compare this crisis actually to the big crisis of the 19th and 20th of the previous century, 20th and 21st century. So the Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis. And what we see is actually some progress in terms of policy making. So there's a very nice graph from Eichengreen and O'Rourke, and which was updated recently by Paul de Gros and G. And it shows that actually this crisis was much sharper, very, very sudden, nothing to do with the previous big crisis, but the rebound was also very sharp. So this is really a different, so we are used to say this time is different, so this time again is different. And this raises a number of questions. The first one is that of macro policies. And so far, I think so far so good. I think both governments and central banks have reacted in an appropriate way. The second thing is micro policies. So how to support the firms and at the same time start the necessary reallocations that will have to be done. How to support the households to reduce the inequalities that are an outcome of this crisis. And a third topic, and this is the topic of today, is the long-term implications in terms of sovereign debts, in terms of central bank balance sheets, in terms of productivity growth. So in the short term, I will give you just a very short perspective on France. What has happened in 2020 is that the shock was, you said it was about 10% or 11% of GDP compared with the counterfactual of 2020 without a crisis. And if the government had done nothing, the shock would have been supported by the firms, the corporate sector, by as much as 78% of the shock, 9% for the households, which including individual firms, and only 13% for the government in terms of automatic stabilizers. And what happened is in France is that, in fact, ex post, for the whole year, the government will be absorbing something like 63% of the shock, so almost 2/3 of the shock. Okay, so this is the short term. And now we are moving to the recovery plans and to longer term perspectives. And what are the objectives of these recovery plans that are being built in the different EU countries? The most obvious one is the short-term recovery. And we know that the faster we come back to the pre-crisis trend, the less scars will be left from the crisis. So we need to be very fast. Then also to correct, and this has been very, very important in the making of the French recovery plan, to tackle pre-existing weaknesses in the economy in order to boost long-term GDP growth and especially productivity growth after the crisis. But, and there is a but, it needs to be a different growth. So we ended up into a 100 billion recovery plan in 3/3. One is the greening, 1/3 is greening, a third is skills and social cohesion, and the third is competitiveness. And what was thought about was especially the supply side. So it's a kind of oxymoron to have a recovery plan that is in a large part a supply side policy, because normally fiscal policy is about demand management. So there is a lot of demand management in the plan for the first 2 years, 21 and 22, which are mainly public investments. So it's short-term demand, but it's long-term supply. And on the top of that, there is a lot of supply side, and the supply side is expected to deliver in the longer term, starting in 23, 24. So, and this program focuses on correcting the main weaknesses of the French economy pre-crisis, which were first the skills shortage, so the mismatch between the skills available in the market and what is required by the firms. Second, the production taxes, which were thought as extremely high in France by international standards. So there's a permanent tax cuts for the corporate sector. And third, innovation and the digitalization of the economy. Like in other countries, SMEs are lagging behind. Not like in all European countries, but in the large European countries. I think Jörg will say the same for the German economy. The SMEs are somewhat lagging behind in terms of digitalization. So this was an occasion to boost and to give an impetus to these investments. And I will finish on this, because we're going to publish a report very soon about the retail sector, and we've calculated that over the first lockdown, those shops that were digitalized were already digitalized, so their turnover for 25% less than the other ones. So I think this crisis is a demonstration that digitalization can help not only for productivity growth, but also for resilience. And this is understood now at the very, very micro and local level, which is a good aspect of the crisis, if there is one. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Agnès. And there you already touched on a lot of points that we will certainly want to explore. Certainly the digitalization aspect and how this can help overcome the current crisis, but hopefully also makes us more resilient for future ones, and also how we may be able to emerge stronger from this crisis by actually learning about the things that need to be done that we weren't aware of that much before, certainly didn't act upon them. So Dr. Jörg Kukies, I mean, you were already addressed by Agnès, and you were my choice for a second speaker at this point. I mean, Germany has done comparatively well in this pandemic so far. I mean, leaving the case numbers aside, they are not so good right now. But certainly the German government has been extremely generous with a huge aid package. And I read that only now this is going to be prolonged again, certainly for the month of December as the lockdown continues. I think the talk is about an additional 17 billion euros. So there's a lot of money pumped into the system. Where do you see the biggest challenges that were highlighted by this pandemic, and can money alone solve it?
Well, I think money can obviously do a lot, but it can't be the panacea. So I think the response that we had to the crisis was a combination of simply expenditures, but also policy measures on the one side that kept the loan channel alive, and on the other side, policy measures that kept the corporate sector flexible and able to respond to the impact of the crisis. So on the pure fiscal expenditure side, I think we've really made the effort on the one side of protecting those most vulnerable, both in terms of economic sectors and individuals, by direct grants and aid. But of course, we've also done quite a lot on the taxation side, for example, to allow companies to alleviate their stressed liquidity situation by tax carry backwards, and by allowing the short-term labor scheme to come to full fruition, and by expanding it, by increasing the applicability, by making sure that the funds flow quickly if there is people put into the short labor schemes, so that really the key transmission mechanism of which we were afraid, namely that after the initial shock there would be a sort of a second follow-up through a credit crunch situation, which would then again lead to adverse effects. That was really that I think was the key success that we had, that actually credit ended up expanding in the third quarter instead of I think, as in every crisis, with the current depths shrinking. So I think that really helped us to get on a reasonable growth path. Of course, a lot of the other aspects why our negative growth is less negative than in other member states also has to do with the structure of our economy, the fact that we are more exposed to regions of the world that are suffering less from the crisis, the fact that we have a much smaller tourism sector than other member states. I think those are more the sort of non-policy issues. Of course, the other elements that we tried to introduce to keep the loan channel alive is the very substantial guarantee programs. And I would like to sort of be realistic about those. Because we do have a dichotomy that both those who say that Germany has a hugely disproportionately large share of the credit guarantee schemes in Europe are right, as well as those who say that Germany has a disproportionately small share of guarantee programs compared to Europe. And now everyone will be surprised how those two match. And the answer is very simple. We deliberately decided to learn from the psychological effect that the European Central Bank has used in the past of making unlimited commitments. And we basically told our economy that come what may, KfW guarantee programs will remain available, and we massively increased the available domestic guarantee program all the way up to 850 billion. Those numbers, and we instituted our economic stabilization fund with a total volume of 600 billion. So that makes our programs look absolutely massively outsized. If you look at the amount of funds that were actually drawn, the KfW program that we have for loan guarantees now has applications for 58 billion, which is actually smaller than some of the other member states in Europe. And I think there is a correlation between what I said about the more modest impact on our economy overall, namely our GDP contraction is more benign than in other member states. So very naturally, the reliance on state guaranteed credit channel is less. But on the other side, I also think that we were a bit successful by basically giving everyone the comfort that even if they come to us in December or in January or in February with liquidity needs, we'll still be there for them. So in that sense, I think that actually worked quite well. So if you take the actually drawn amounts from our programs, we're actually, as I recently saw in an analysis by Bruegel, we're actually lower than average than within Europe. So I think that is a conscious effort. And the other point that we, of course, made in the recent days and weeks is that we will also be there for further fiscal expansion for the remainder of 2020 and for 21. And we've shown that at least so far in November, we're coping with the current lockdown soft reasonably well, because we essentially told all sectors of our economy that are directly affected by the shutdown that we will compensate 75% of their revenues as an exemption measure up to the de minimis amounts in the European Union in a very simplistic and very easy to handle manner. Of course, the criticism that we're getting, and I'm sure I will get later on in this debate, that is somewhat untargeted and we're benefiting some and not others, is absolutely valid. Yes, we will have some areas where we're paying more than we needed to, but the trade-off is, of course, simplicity versus perfection, and there we chose simplicity, and hopefully with that, in the short time of the current restrictions on some businesses, we'll be able to get out of the situation quite well.
All right.
I haven't mentioned Europe yet, but I'm sure we'll get back to that later.
We'll definitely get there. Everybody gets their turn. But thank you for now, Jörg. And yeah, a lot of stimulus, a lot of thought going into the amount of money. But is this the right approach? Is Europe actually following the never miss a good crisis mantra? That is a question I would like now to pose to Piroska. So from your perspective, as somebody who has the big picture in mind, how has Europe fared?
Thank you very much, Monika, and thank you for having me for this phenomenal panel, sharing the panel with such illustrious policymakers. The short answer to your question is that yes, Europe has delivered, and I'm going in the first time, I think, in my professional life, I'm going really positive on Europe. What Europe has really done, and I'm not saying it because now, just the background, we of course have a game changer because we have the vaccine, and that's multiple of vaccines in sight, and that really anchors expectations in a positive way, and we will see a rebound and recovery. But this is not why I'm saying. I think Europe has developed and delivered itself a number of small policy game changers, which on the whole amounts to a significant reform during the crisis. And I think that really bodes well for the European project. What has been gone right? And I'm not going to be critical. I know that there have been a lot of problems and hiccups, but overall, very appropriate crisis management, adaptation of the fiscal rules, suspended, state aid regulations relaxed. The central bank, the ECB, has really grown up to be now a global central bank, definitely a regional central bank, almost like beyond the responsibility of just the Eurozone and going beyond and really taking care of other countries who use the euro as a currency. And I mean, of course, emerging Europe primarily. I want to stop here because this is very important. This is almost as revolutionary as the whatever it takes was at Mr. Draghi's, the President Draghi's sort of game changer of the Eurozone crisis in 2011. For the ECB to step in with currency swaps and also with repo lines to emerging market Europe has been a real game changer and the recognition of the regional global role of the euro. Hats off to Madame Lagarde. Also, the ECB is looking kind of beyond the crisis. Some of what Agnès mentioned, really looking at how to deal with the crisis legacy. I was very impressed by Andrea's article in the FT calling for a European level asset management company. That if those we are around this virtual table know very well that during the global financial crisis, that was a no-no. And that's on the table. I'm not saying that's the right approach, etc. Well done with the right skills, probably is. But again, Europe is also looking beyond to the crisis, dealing with the crisis legacy. So that's very good. Also, the EU recovery funds, in the end, there were initial hiccups, but in the end, the amounts are impressive. Very nicely distributed. Again, emerging Europe, a little bit bringing that perspective here, if I may, is benefiting, hopefully, with the right political conditionality. There's an external factor, regionalization, that is happening is also helping Europe. Because hyper-globalization, as we have seen it, and we have seen some of the manifestations of the problems coming from hyper-globalization, also is helping Europe. Beyond that, what are the other, as Agnès started to name, COVID impacts, which I think will be there long term. So we might as well just embrace it and internalize it and build it into government policy looking forward. Some that Agnès has mentioned, the concern of debt sustainability, central government balance sheet, etc., are concerns. I have a slightly unusual way of thinking about it. I'm much less concerned that usually economists are, but happy to discuss later. But on the positive, remote working is there to stay. So all the way we work will be changing, and we might as well include this in our macro and also micro management approaches. the whole real estate market will be rebalanced, and I think it's not a bad thing when we think that secondary cities are getting a boost from people preferring to stay at home and working in a bigger house environment, which allows for gardening and home office and the like. And of course, the big thing is digitalization. Digitalization is really driven, is accelerated. It's really like a revolutionary change what we have seen during the crisis. Telemedicine, which was just a tiny little segment of, for example, the American market that I know a little bit better. It was, Madame Lagarde was actually citing this number a month ago. A few percentage point of total services, now it's close to 50 in America. Education in my area, I'm coming from London School of Economics. Education is revolutionized. It is hard, it is challenging, but we know that we will never go back to pre-COVID, even when the pandemic is over. And that is a good thing. It's a lot of competition. Basically, education is becoming a truly global good, but I think that's, as an economist, I think that is a good thing. And in little things, the statistics is completely revolutionary. I'm not going to go there because it's taking too much time. Some caution. We are happy of the big packages. We are happy the way this crisis has been managed, but the government is very big. It has been, and with all due respect, we see responsible government representatives here, but the rest of the world may not be. Even sort of in some cases, even in Europe, the government, big government programs can be subject to cronyism, and even the UK, which I know a little bit closer, normally where I live, there has been serious questions about the way government contracts have been granted. But beyond that, the use of state-owned bank, the state-owned enterprises, obviously it's good for counter-cyclical policies, employment maintenance, but long-term, very not good news for innovation.
Right.
Yes. So yes, I'm finishing. That's I'm finishing. So what I'm saying again, we can be positive for once. We can be positive about Europe. Europe has done well, has learned all the lessons that to be learned from the global financial crisis, has done the right thing. We can discuss details, etc., but that really doesn't matter. And I think the regional forces coming out from globalization also will help to give further boost to Europe.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And obviously, it's nice to hear that Europe's done well in handling the crisis. Let's find out if Ivan Faiella there agrees with you. Certainly, I mean, I've found, or I remembered that Brussels just a few weeks ago scaled back the expectations for the EU's economic recovery. They forecast now a rebound from the impact of the pandemic will take at least 2 years. Also, in addition to what we heard earlier from Johannes Hahn, some sort of political squabbling there in agreeing now on the EU budget and everything sort of slightly being delayed, the money that is needed also for the rescue fund. There are a lot of issues at play. So, Ivan, I mean, what does the current pandemic and the impact it has mean for financial issues that are linked to sustainability? And with sustainability, meaning really the issue of fighting climate change and all the green technology and everything that also still needs to be promoted, to be developed, to be deployed, to go to market. Ivan, I leave the rest over to you.
Okay, it's an easy question, by the way. Well, we started a journey just before the pandemic. With the Green New Deal, there was this unprecedented decision of the Commission say, in a couple of decades from now, we are going to change completely our energy system. So we are going to be climate neutral. What does it mean? We are going to get rid of fossil fuels. That was, it was a shocking moment, because to do that, you have to change the relative price. It means that you want to increase the price of those, the traditional fuels, and you want to switch to the sustainable, the low carbon fuels. And you want to do that in a just way, because sustainable, I like to remind you that we have both the components, that the idea that you want to live in a better world, in a sense, having a better relationship with the environment, but at the same time, we want to be sure that, the cost of this transition are not paid by, the vulnerable subjects. So that's even a more difficult task. But again, I have to praise, as the previous speaker said, the Europe and Europe decision, because even in the after the pandemic, and we know the pandemic changed a lot the energy landscape. We reduced our energy use not because there was a structural shift, but because there was just a reduction in the activity. Actually, there was also a structural shift because. Previously was mentioned, smart working means that there was a change in the energy mix. So transportation was less used, and then means that you are using less oil and oil products, for example. You are staying more at home, you're using more electricity, and that boosts, for example, renewables in the energy sector. That was a very interesting experiment in Italy, I think, also in Germany and other countries, because, for example, we experimented a kind of, 2030 situation, because we have most of the electricity generated by renewables, and that's a great thing. But as you know, when you have renewables, variable renewables must be managed somehow. So it implies that you have to cut, for example, import from abroad. You have to manage the secondary markets, the secondary market. So it was a nice experiment to have an idea of what are the challenges ahead. These challenges means that, you have to have policy of decarbonization that at the end of the day, someone has to pay for. This means that you have to protect vulnerable households, to assure that, are protecting somehow the competitiveness of European firms. And this the idea of having not just carbon taxation, but also carbon border tax adjustment. How this does reflect on the financial system? Well, if the real economy is hit, as in the pandemic, this is obviously reflected by some kind of reflection on the financial system. For example, it means that business that are closely related to the fossil fuels use in terms of infrastructure, distribution, or import are going to be at risk if the transition happens. But if the transition does not happen, anyway, they are going to be hit because, climate change is here. We know that. I mean, part of the energy demand reduction was not just due to the pandemic, but to climate because, it's very warm, was very warm. 2020 is going to be on track to be one of the hottest year on track in Europe and probably in the world. So these things are now part of the agenda. And again, Europe is behaving well, not just because big chunk of the recovery funds will be devoted to, climate protection and to the energy transition, but also because European Central Bank, for example, didn't leave apart the idea of having in its monetary policy review strategy also climate change. Climate change is clearly, you before said, never waste a crisis, exactly the title of the speech of Isabel Schnabel is underlying how this discussion is part of the agenda of central bankers, we can say now all across the globe, because the Fed is and for example, at the Network for Greening the Financial System, there is this group of people working at central bank and financial supervision, trying to have idea of how to include these problems in the standard tools that we use. We are now probably when we will have the Federal Reserve in few months from now, and we are very excited by that because we know that this is a global issue. We know global partnership for that. It's not easy. I mean, it's a long journey. We just started, and and it's going to be a difficult one. But again, if we were able in the crisis to not change the track of the journey, I think that's a great achievement. So we know that we have a lot of things to do, but we are learning. We are changing our culture. I work for a central bank, and it's incredible now how within a central bank in a couple of years, talking about these things is just going to be a standard. And I think in the future it's going to be, and I think that this is just a great improvement because sometimes we are looking at the world, with a small lens, with using our lingo, using our jargon, and we have difficulties in speaking with other guys working with a different perspectives. So I think it's a very interesting challenge. Everybody's on board, and let's try to do this. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's going to be very interesting to live in these times.
Well, thank you so much, Eve, and quite an upbeat response to some very worrying issues. But you seem there quite optimistic, similar to Piroska, that we're on the right track. I would like to use just a second to remind our participants, our viewers, that of course you're invited to join the discussion, and all you have to do is submit your question using the FA or QA button at the bottom of your screen, or in whatever language you have your screen set up. It's at the bottom of the screen. Don't use the chat, that won't work, but you can submit your questions, and I'm happy to pass them on to our panelists. I actually have some from earlier on, which I will use in just a moment, but I would like to go back to Agnès and Jörg, because Agnès, you mentioned something about different growth, and mentioned something like also education and digitalization. Digitalization was also an issue mentioned from Jörg in the German finance ministry as one of the big tasks. How do you think this pandemic, I mean, digitalization, there's this big study out by the World Economic Forum that actually says that in 5 years, and now it's actually 4 years, by 2025, almost 90 million jobs will be gone due to the speed of digitalization that was boosted by the pandemic. But a little bit more, something like 97 million new jobs will be created. Well, we're talking about a time span of 4 to 5 years. Perhaps starting with you, Jörg, is Germany ready to start all the reskills that is necessary in order to keep all these people at work?
Yes, I think that is certainly something that we are promoting quite heavily. And we have a very far-reaching and ambitious program on the entire digitization topic up and running. That'll encompass many sectors of our economy, that will give the right incentives for the qualification. And on top of that, I think it's also very important that we have a new legislation that's taking effect gradually, that gives an additional channel to migration into our country. So far, migration into Germany has been dominated by humanitarian aspects, but we now have legislation that allows anyone with qualifications to work in Germany productively, to get a temporary visa to find a job, and to enter our country very easily, have sufficient time to find a job, and then get permanent work permits, etc. So I think that will also be extremely important, because of course we have a lot of inflow into our country within the European Union, but so far limited from outside, and hopefully this legislation can change that, and that will reinvigorate our economy. Then another channel where we are hopeful for digitization is laws that we pass, sort of in anticipation of the European Union's digital union. We've already passed legislation to digitize our bond markets, so it'll be possible completely to do the issuance, trading, settlement, custody of bonds through tokens. That's trial. We will move into completely additional asset classes after that, i.e. equities, participations in startups are all possibilities to digitize completely. We've attracted interests from 60 blockchain companies as a result of legislation that we passed on a regulatory framework for the safekeeping and custody of crypto assets. So that's leading to an influx. So that's all very good. And all of that is part of our blockchain strategy, where we hope to exploit all of the benefits that the blockchain can provide to us. And we have a very intensely working group between our financial sector and leading innovative companies in Germany to guide us and to give us advice on how to proceed with the discussion on programmable currency. And I think that's another one of these areas in the financial sector that can be extremely positive to spur the innovative powers of our country. And last but not least, we just announced, fresh off the press very shortly, that we are giving a very substantial tax break to startup companies that attract talent into our country through employee stock options and employee equity, and will give beneficial treatment to those employees, as well as our plan to abolish VAT on management fees for venture capital funds. And that then hopefully this week will culminate in a decision by German Parliament to inaugurate a 10 billion future fund that will use all of our co-investment instruments that we have through KfW and many other instruments to give pari passu and scaling up startup investments by this amount of 10 billion euros. So we're very, very keen to get our very much lively and interesting startup culture in Berlin and many other cities up and running and scaling up.
Well, you see, the ministry seems to have deep pockets, certainly. I just have one follow-up question for you, Jörg, because you mentioned those tax reliefs also earlier. Of course, all this huge stimulus, the huge aid package, which at some point the money has to be gathered again. And there has been sort of rumors that eventually these tax cuts, the tax relief, will eventually come back to haunt us. Can you calm our nerves in that respect?
Well, I mean, the numbers all sound very large, and they are large. However, if you go through the actual impact on our debt to GDP ratio, we've increased to the low 70s, which is occurring according to the current projections, and that, depending on how deep the pandemic continues and how much aid we have to give, may increase into closer to the mid 70s. I don't know, but that's something we'll fine tune. So that is in no way, shape, or form concerning. After the global financial crisis, the number was much larger than the low to mid 70s. And that is, you know, like as you can imagine, given that growth projections for next year are 4% plus nominal growth, you know, the likelihood that we stabilize at that level and then if things normalize again, go back towards the 60%, which is our aim, may be possible without big tax increase program. But that is still that is still being debated. There's no decisions made yet on that, and certainly at the moment we're in the expenditure mode, not in the tax raising mode.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to bring in Agnès now, and the questions from the audience are flooding in now. So I'll pick one up that is directed at you. What do you think about the decision in France to appoint a task force to discuss about how to make public finance sustainable in the future? What solution would you suggest?
Okay, thanks for the question. Maybe I will answer this question quickly and then come back to the growth question. On this particular decision, if I had the answer to your question, I probably the task force would not be needed. So I think it's quite welcome to have this task force. It's not a spending review. The idea is to think about the governance of public finance in France, and especially the interconnection between the state, the social security, and the local levels, and how to make it more efficient, more transparent, and more trackable. There has been, on the occasion of this recovery plan, there has been a lot of effort that has been put on the governance and the transparency of the spending. You can, I can give you the address. You can go online and see day after day how the money is spent, where in France, and so on. And also there is a committee. There's a committee that is evaluating the impact of these measures, support measures for the companies, and there will be another committee for evaluating the recovery plan. So these questions are taken very seriously. Obviously, France is going to come out of the crisis with a huge pile of new debts. and there is determination to tackle this debt, at least to anchor it. So we are in a thin line because we need to avoid hiking taxes just after the crisis, which was done after the previous crisis with a very negative impact. And then there will be no choice. Growth will do part of the job, but we still need to anchor public finances, and this needs to be prepared while we are in the middle of the crisis. Although, of course, this is no time to adjust the deficit. So this is the idea. Maybe if you allow me to come back to this very interesting discussion on reallocations, and I think this will be the clue and the key of the post-crisis period, how to reallocate jobs and capital across sectors, within sectors, geographically across occupations. So there's going to be a huge challenge in terms of reallocation. Fortunately, two structural reforms were passed just before the crisis in France for professional training. Professional training is extremely difficult in all countries. Two reforms were passed just before the crisis in France. One was for adults, a disintermediation of the training system, where now you can go directly to provider of training. You get on your mobile phone, you can decide to go for training, and you have some euros that are accumulated over time when you work, and you can spend it freely without going to a job agency and being accompanied. So for the scaling up we need after the crisis, I think this will be helpful, although of course not everybody can do it by him or herself. And there was another reform which was quite significant about apprenticeship. So the idea was to introduce a kind of market, although it's entirely public, but the idea is to give the money to the grant to the student, no longer to the schools. So the idea was that the student would come with the firm and the grant to a school in order to study. So this would put more flexibility and to the system again to tackle the mismatch I was mentioning before, and also to make it more attractive for the youth. And actually this is working very well, and we're quite happy that the number of apprentices this year is about the same as last year, and last year was well above historic standards. So for the first time we have something that seems to deliver in this area of professional training.
Right.
Now, to finish with it, the recovery plan will be spending a lot of money in some specific areas. We mentioned digitalization. There's also the renovation of the buildings. And the idea also is to have a significant impact on the supply side. So of course, this recovery plan is not going to be a game changer in terms of the transition, because it needs to be a massive investment from everybody, not just the government. However, what we hope is that it will be significant enough for the supply side to react and to have some to organize itself in order to be able to provide the services for the years to come.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I would like to continue straight away. And I would even encourage you to give me a show of hands if you feel like you want to have a go with the question. If not, I'm just picking one of you. Because you can also rank questions, as I see. And the one with the most thumbs up right now goes like this. So there's a question from Alfredo Rizzo, and he wants to know, or he says, I think all problems or problematic issues standing behind the last EU enlargement stand before us now, starting from rule of law issues, something that the EU Commissioner Johannes Hahn commented on earlier, and ending with administrative capacity to manage new EU funds. Now, all this has just been worsened by the pandemic. I would include in this analysis also difficult regional and local areas, such as those in southern Italy, where EU funds have not been utilized due to structural weaknesses. So here's basically not a question, but an analysis from one of our viewers on the kind of problems that we are faced with here in the EU, basically pointing out that a lot of the problems have not actually been introduced by the pandemic, but at best highlighted. And because there is a very specific mentioning of regional local areas in southern Italy where the funds have not been utilized due to structural weaknesses, maybe Ivan wants to have a go first of all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a well-known problem. I mean, and if you want, the pandemic has in a way exacerbated that problem. We, for example, are seeing that also the managing of the pandemic was, not facilitated. Let me use that term. By different regional strategies. Having a regional strategy is a great thing because the idea is that better your territory so you can quickly respond to the actual request. But, there is a structural issue with the public administration in general and in particular with big regional disparities in Italy. That's historical stuff. And I don't think these things is going to change quickly. But, there are some, the things that you were mentioning before, for example, about digitalization. Digitalization is not just a quicker way to do things. It's also a way to keep people accountable, for example, keep people administration. So now it's pretty easy to see if the process regarding a given request is taking too much time, or even, for example, as I mentioned before, the different targets or the different problems that can affect the environment in a different part of the country are present or not. So these things is going to help the democratic process. I mean, the only solution to these things is the democratic process. So people must be aware that maybe the issues that they care for are not well tackled by their administration, and they have to use their vote for that. This is, the general problem of, if you want, the bureaucracy that is not working. I don't want to hide the problem of crime. We know that there are areas of the country that are affected by it, but I think that problem is now at the European/global level. No, it's not less. It's not just a matter that regards certain, for example, area of the southern part of Italy. There is an issue of good administration. So obviously there are areas of the countries like Tuscany or Emilia-Romagna that are, very efficient. They know how to speak with the citizens. They know how to react to the request of the citizens. On the just transition topics, we have wonderful projects in Emilia-Romagna to tackle energy poverty with social housing. They are excellent. And we have nothing like that in Lazio or in other regions. We know, it's useless not having the idea where the problem is. And then we have to act, keeping in mind again, that people has the power really in this sense. And it's not just because of the democratic process. It's just a matter of culture. I think in some areas of the countries there is people that is less aware of their rights. It's about your right. It's not about a favor or a preferential channel or whatever. It's kind of Putnam, you should read Putnam and apply his suggestion. It's going to take time, and it's going to, I think that one of the, maybe again, with sustainability, we should also consider what is the role of something that is very, maybe is considered fluffy, but I think it's very important. There is social capital, the role of social capital in pushing and in implementing reforms and transitions.
Right. Well, thank you, Ivan. I'm very interested to hear Piroska's view there. Certainly, because you complimented the EU before so much, but there are certain inherent challenges, let's put it. And so, from your perspective, what needs to be done in order to overcome them?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very positive, but of course, as Agnès herself highlighted at the beginning, France, but all European countries have to deal with pre-crisis weaknesses, and they are just there. and some of it has been fired up to some extent. For example, inequality. Women's role, we haven't discussed this, but that's an important issue as well. Just wanted to mention, following up on Ivan's excellent point on the regional dislocation, that fellow Italian, a very dear colleague of mine at the LSE, Riccardo Crescenzi, just finished a project showing that indeed the new EU recovery fund, the type of investment it's envisaging, is very likely not to go to underserved regions, including in Italy. So it's something that should be kind of a red flag a little bit to policymakers in Brussels, and think of complementing instruments or modifying perhaps instruments in that regard. But let me mention something. The whole idea of massive reliance on remote working, which I think will happen, it is there, not going to go away. The changing business model that comes with it will have a little bit of a regional level playing field between regions. So I think we can kind of count on business internalizing the advantages and also our workers ourselves, citizens internalizing the advantages of this forced model, and take advantage in a sense that reduces the premium on location, on kind of well-established locations.
Now you can hear me again.
Did you lose me or?
No,
sorry.
No,
okay.
I was just surprised that you just stopped without me interrupting. That is the first.
I was learning,
No, I had to count to 3. Say yes, okay. But anyway, thank you so much. And I just want to inform you that we have 10 minutes left, and there are still some questions here that I would like to pass on to you from the participants, and picking up on the kind of the way that the money is being spent. Your Kukies mentioned something earlier that he might, or the finance ministry might get reprimanded for the way they're doing things. There's a question submitted by Stephanie Ho. What if, for example, the finance minister of Slovakia does rather prefer to spend on innovation, no matter how climate friendly or not, and education, and he claims that climate considerations in general are way less important? Are EU countries, no matter if southern, northern, or eastern EU countries, having a common vision of environmental, social, and debt sustainability in mind, or not? And can there be such a common goal in the future, or will there be one needed for a smaller EU? Who would like to have a go at that?
I mean, the answer is...
sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
The answer is yes. First. It's very simple. I can keep it short. The Council of all heads of state and government have agreed on massively prioritizing the green expenditure in the Next Generation EU program and in the medium-term financial framework for that. And everyone has endorsed the Green Deal put forward by the EU Commission. So I think there's definitely at the level of the governments, there's a full agreement that that transforming the economy in the direction of meeting our climate goals is definitely a consensus topic. Of course, there are always nuances on the level of commitment in each member state, and we all know the debates on that. But in general, prioritizing the green aspect of the Next Generation EU package is definitely a consensus topic.
Right, Ivan. And before,
if I may, Monika, two good reasons why Slovakia should be happy to tackle climate change. The first one is transition. I mean, if you are using renewables with the present costs, installing a PV plant at the utility scale is going to cost you less than coal. I mean, it's cheaper. It's not a matter that is good for the environment. It's just cheaper. First point. Second point, I mean, let's let's concentrate more on adaptation. I mean, what's going to happen if we don't do nothing? So, I mean, in terms of adapting to these changes, we have heat waves in Italy, in the southern part, in Greece, in Spain, but they have heat waves in the Carpathian as well. There is a modification, intensification, precipitation patterns. I think there are a lot of flash floods and river floods as well in Slovakia. So, I mean, these things of climate change is going to have an effect across the board. So that's the reason why it makes good sense to prioritize this topic. No, there is no country that is isolated by that.
I'm just moving on, and I'm combining some of the questions because it was again pointed out that in Germany, in most EU countries, the crisis, so we're talking about the pandemic here, has revealed just how unprepared we are for the challenges related to digitalizing economy and education, not to mention governments. What are concretely the measures that are being taken here to overcome these issues? I think Jörg has already given us some examples of what Germany is doing, but in combination to that question, so what exactly is being done in various countries to overcome this problem? A question, how could the European Union help less developed countries in the digitalization process to recover from existing imbalances? Who would like to tackle that? Everyone says here. Agnès.
Yeah, so maybe just a word on the climate change issue and Slovakia. I think we should mention much more the co-benefits of climate change policies. There are local pollution issues in Slovakia as in other countries, and also the benefit for the population in terms of comfort, in terms of quality of life. So this is difficult because we cannot evaluate it easily in euros. So then everybody counts in GDP or employment, and the efforts put, for instance, by the OECD to try to introduce new metrics to evaluate the impact of policies so far have not been very successful. So also, I think this crisis is also an occasion to renovate our way of taking decisions in the public arena. But maybe I'm too optimistic, even more maybe than Piroska. So on digitalization in practice, so these programs are just starting. So I have an example now about the retail sector. The retail sector is quite large in the economy, the retail, the shops, and there's going to be a subsidization of the digitalization. So it's very simple, is to have their own website in order to be able to sell online. And it's also true for SMEs. Many SMEs don't even have a website, a web page in order to present their products. So these are very, very basic investments. And this is the occasion to help these SMEs to scale up and to catch up, I would say, with the big tech companies. Well, that will not replace the big tech companies, but it's very important that they're able to provide the same kind of service. And actually, it's working quite well. We had this bookshop problem because the government decided that bookshops were not essential. So there was a big discussion about that, and actually. People are ordering their books online and they queue up in the street to get the books. So they cannot, of course, read them in the shop, but it's better than nothing. And actually, it can make a huge difference, as I said before, not just in productivity growth, but for also resilience to the next shocks.
Right. Well, thank you, Agnès. And sadly, with an eye on the clock, I hand over to Piroska. With us, yes. Short answer, please.
To this question, or we are closing?
What? No.
Okay.
You just wanted
I mentioned something. Just follow up on what Agnès said, and the question of what type of measures can be put forward. Also greening these measures. There are quite a good research studies which would show that actually investment it doesn't matter what type of support governments are giving for climate change type of investment. If it's loan, it is less effective in terms of long-term growth and governance than if you give it with some equity support, for example. So what I'm saying is that there is a lot of good research that can inform policymaking, even when we go into detail of this type of policies. Also, as Jörg very rightly said, supporting startups. This is a huge issue, and Europe has a big disadvantage, as we know, relative to other economies, particularly the US, but not only the US. So supporting startups and giving the right, whether it's equity support, it's tax support, etc. Countries may differ. That can be also very powerful. So use research to inform your policy decisions. That's my final message, if I may, from the LSE.
Well, then thank you very much. And also thank you to all the questions that were submitted. And I do hope that all four panelists will be as generous as EU Commissioner Johannes Hahn by offering that they will take a look at those questions and maybe answer them individually, because unfortunately we don't have time to fit them in anymore. We just have enough time for one last final round with answers of about 1 minute each, if you manage. And basically, just as a conclusion, I mean, what is the chance that you see that this crisis offers? In every crisis, there's an opportunity. What opportunity do you see in this in order to secure sustainable and inclusive growth for Europe? And I would like to start with your Kukies, because he already sits very close to the microphone.
I would say deeper fiscal integration as a result of the Next Generation EU package, both on the expenditure side. If we find a good governance to incentivize exactly some of the investments that Ivan has pointed out that are lacking, and in terms of the joint financing of this instrument, it could also help our capital markets union and many of the other projects as a positive corollary. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's bring in a lady now, Agnès. Very brief, what is the opportunity that we need to see in this crisis?
Okay, I tend to agree with Jörg. I think we have a common goal. We have even a common commitment with the Paris Agreement in terms of carbon emissions. Before the crisis, we had a common strategy, which was the green strategy. And now we have a common funding. And the next step is to have a common resource. So there's still a step forward. I very hope that we can move forward.
All right. Thank you very much, Agnès. Piroska, are you sitting comfortably, and are you ready to give us your very short takeaway, the main opportunity of this crisis, please?
Can I be a little bit controversial and at the very end to give some caution? And that is on the importance of states and governments to have a clear exit strategy from these massive stimulus packages. Politically, it's always very difficult. It's difficult for governments. I would even argue that it's difficult for central banks to withdraw for big, quantitative easing programs. But it's very important. In the end, the markets have to work and government has to enable. So that's my one last bit.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. And Ivan, obviously, you're the last. Please.
Well, I complement, we have common targets. We will have common EU green bonds emissions that it seems ECB is keen to buy. So it's rather an integration over here. We have a common carbon price for ETS. Hopefully, we're going to have a common carbon taxation. So, I mean, it's not just having, common principles, but there is a system that is working. So, as I said before, not only we have, a journey that is designed, but also it seems that the ship is going. No, I mean, we are putting the fuel in our ship. So, we start the journey, and that's a great thing. I mean, and let's hope for the best.
Let's hope for the best, and please put green fuel into the ship that's going.
Yep, biofuel.
Thank you so much, Ivan Faiella, Senior Economist at the Bank of Italy. Also, big thank you to Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, Chief Economist at the French Treasury. Piroska, Nagy, Mohacsi, something like that, close, Interim Director of the LSE's Institute of Global Affairs, and of course, Dr. Jörg, Kukies, State Secretary for Financial Market Policy and European Policy at the Federal Ministry of Finance. Thank you to all four of you for your contribution. And it is now my task to just briefly share with everyone what's happening tomorrow on day 2, because there will be another conference day, a big one, focusing, for example, on EU integration and solidarity, as well as productivity of the public sector and public procurement. And thanks to digitalization, thanks to pandemic, the fact that we have to do this digitally, there is an advantage to it, because the guests can be further afield. We're very happy tomorrow to welcome a panel of guests based mainly in the US for an obviously very topical discussion on the US election, what impact on EU-US-Asia trade relations. And Jennifer Baker, journalist and broadcaster, she'll be taking care of tomorrow's proceedings. And with that, I would like to turn again to our host, Clemens Fuß, who I'm sure has been listening to everything. And I would like to ask you, Clemens Fuß, what is your takeaway of today's discussions?
Thank you very much, Monika, and thanks to all panel members. I think this was a fascinating discussion. It was also an optimistic one, so we have focused more on the opportunities than on the drawbacks in this crisis. The times are changing. I also thought it's interesting that with Jörg Kukies, the German Secretary of State, says fiscal integration is the big opportunity in this crisis. So those who remember the financial crisis and the Euro crisis do remember that the tone of the debate was different, and beyond that, Europe was more divided than in this crisis. And Agnès Bénassy emphasized that as well. I think she's completely right. So we kind of seem to have more agreement on where we're going, and that was also reflected, I believe, in Commissioner Hahn's presentation this morning. There are challenges, but as he said, we are kind of used in Europe to negotiating a bit longer sometimes, but in the end, things normally work out. And I think we've got pretty far in this crisis. So that's great. So thanks again to all panel members. Thanks for your time and your contributions. This was really great. Thanks to all behind the scenes, the CESIPO team who have made this possible. And last but by no means least, many thanks to you, Monika, for leading us through this day. This was an exceptional moderation. I hope to see as many as possible of you tomorrow for the second day of the conference. So thank you very much. Thanks, Monika. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks
a lot.
Bye.
Thanks for the opportunities. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.